on to the next phase of your flight training. You've spent a long time looking at all of the visual maneuvers. We've covered all of those now, from all the basic training to low flying, and after this we're going to be moving on to cross-country flying. So now we're having a look at instrument flying, which is really dealing with situations where we have poor visual reference, such as entering inadvertent IMC. This is the first of 4 mass briefs that we will look at, and there's a requirement to have done 5 hours of instrument flight training towards your PPL, more towards your CPL. And here at Massey we'll use the simulator for some of that, and we'll do some in the aeroplane as well. This 5 hours is not going to make you an expert on flying by sole reference to the instruments. You'd really become an expert once you've done your instrument rating, but that's in a few semesters' time. So the skills you're learning in this 5 hours of training are just the basics of how to safely control the aeroplane after an inadvertent IMC entry or in a situation where there's poor visual reference. Instrument flying is difficult because by now you've done human factors and you've learned that most of our orientation comes from our sight. So as soon as we're in cloud, we lose our ability to orientate the aeroplane accurately, and we get conflicting information sent to the brain, and it's hard to resolve that information. And this is why instrument flying is so difficult. This briefing would probably take us about half an hour. Here's our objectives: to experience the sensory illusions that occur when deprived of visual reference. So you've done your human factors exam by now. You would expect by the time they get up to this phase of their training that they would have done the majority of those exams. Now, in the industry, they typically start with flight radio and human factors, the easier ones. So they should know some of the illusions, and so use that as an opportunity to question them later on in the briefing if you want. And to control the aircraft with sole reference to the instruments as well. So these illusions, today's about developing your awareness of that they can happen, what these illusions will look like, and then developing your discipline in how to prevent yourself from falling victim to these illusions, to remain in control of the aeroplane at all times. So let's talk about why these skills are necessary. I've indicated already inadvertent entry into IMC, into instrument meteorological conditions, in other words, flying into cloud. But that's not all that's relevant here. These skills are going to be relevant to when you start doing night flying, which we'll get to in a couple of semesters' time as well. So we're not going into cloud, but we do lose a large part of our visual reference, especially if there's no visible horizon or poor lighting. So it's relevant to that. It's relevant to the terrain awareness flights that you might have already done. It's relevant to the mountain flights that you're going to do in parts 3 and 4 as well. So it's not just about finding ourselves flying into cloud itself. Any situations where there is bad visibility, you've been across you might have been across the Straits on a cross-country flight with your instructor by now. Crossing the Straits, when there's poor visibility, you cannot see the horizon. So it's easy to get disorientated and end up in what we call an unusual attitude. So it's relevant to that as well. We've done low flying. You've seen already that there can be false horizons. You've seen that cloud or bad visibility can obstruct the horizon when you're flying low as well. So lots of reasons why these skills are important for us to learn. This is still attitude flying, just like visual flying, except now we are judging what those attitudes are on the attitude indicator, looking inside the aircraft. But it is still attitude flying. There's 3 fundamental skills that are necessary to safely and competently fly an aeroplane with sole reference to the instruments. And these are instrument interpretation, instrument cross-check, and aircraft control. So today we're going to discuss what the direct and indirect information from each of the instruments available to us is. So by now you're familiar with what the direct information is. You know what each instrument tells us, but each instrument can often tell us some additional secondary instrument or non-direct information. And it's important we're aware of what those are. We're going to talk about an instrument scan a little bit later on in this briefing. So it's important when we're instrument flying, we don't fixate just on one instrument. We have to be scanning all of the flight instruments in order to develop a clear and accurate mental picture of what the aeroplane is doing. And that's necessary if we're to remain in control of the aircraft. So here's our instrument panel on the PFD. Let's now spend a bit of time actually talking about the direct and indirect information available to us from each of those instruments. So we've got our attitude indicator. Notice how it's slap bang in the middle of the PFD, occupies the most space, and that's because we call it our master instrument. It's the most important one because it gives us the most direct information. So this way you could ask your student, okay, what direct information does it give us? What does it tell us? So be careful here not to tell them that its direct information is whether we're climbing and descending. It does not tell you if you are climbing or descending. Because I can be in slow flight with an attitude of whatever, 7 degrees, and the aeroplane's in level flight, right? So it does not tell you that you're climbing or descending. It tells you the attitude that the aeroplane is in relation to the horizon. Does this one have a laser on it? It does. So there's our horizon there. It tells us our attitude in relation to that, and it tells us our angle of bank. That's the direct information. And it's this instrument that we refer back to the most as part of our instrument scan. What about our airspeed indicator there? Well, directly, you know it indicates the airspeed, but indirectly, what do you think it could indicate? What do you guys reckon?
Climbing or descending potentially?
Yeah. Or attitude, either or. So if we see that airspeed reducing or it's low, it could indicate that we're at a high attitude, which could mean we're climbing. Vice versa if it's increasing or is high. Our HSI down here, direct information is the direction we're flying, the heading we're flying. Indirectly, it can indicate your angle of bank. So if you see that heading is changing rapidly, that could indicate that you've got quite a steep angle of bank. Whereas if it's changing slowly, that could indicate a shallower angle of bank. Our altimeter, that's our altitude. Indirectly, it could indicate the attitude of the aeroplane. So if we're seeing the numbers increasing, then the attitude is high. If those numbers are increasing rapidly, then maybe it's a very high attitude, and vice versa for low. Vertical speed indicator is really a trend indicator, directly indicating the rate of climb or rate of descent or whether we're flying level. Indirectly tells you whether you are climbing or descending. Slip skid bar indirectly tells you whether or not the aeroplane is yawing, and if it's yawing, it might also be turning. So we've got a range of direct and indirect information available to us, and we've got to be aware of all of that. Our engine instrument panel over here as well, particularly the manifold pressure and RPM. We need to scan those. If you're flying a fixed pitch aeroplane like Foxy, your RPM can indirectly indicate whether you are climbing or descending. So if you've accidentally pitched the nose up without changing the throttle setting, the RPM reduces, vice versa with a descent. And you'll hear the air noise changing as well. So lots of information is available to you, not just direct, there's this indirect information. And now we've got to put it all together into an instrument scan. So we've found ourselves, say, in a situation of poor visual reference. Maybe we have accidentally flown into cloud. It's time now to talk about how do we actually put all that information together to do an instrument scan so we remain in control of the aeroplane. There are really 3 types of instruments. There's flight instruments, which includes things like your attitude indicator, your airspeed indicator, your horizontal situation indicator, and your altimeter. You've got your engine instruments, your T's and P's, but also your RPM and your manifold pressure. And then you've got ancillary instruments, your slip, skid bar, and your VSI, or you could think of these as secondary instruments as well. You can further break that down into control instruments and performance instruments. There are two instruments in particular that are responsible for directly controlling the aeroplane, and that is your attitude indicator and the manifold pressure and RPM in the case of a DA40. Changes to either one of those things directly affects all the indications that we see on all the other instruments. And we call all of those other instruments the performance instruments because they are used to measure the performance of the aeroplane. So you won't find information in the speaker notes about that. I like to talk about performance and control instruments. That's what the CAA has in their briefing as well. Oops. So we've just entered inadvertent IMC. We've got caught out in bad weather conditions. We've elected that the best thing for us to do is, well, we've accidentally entered the cloud here. Now we've got to figure out a primary scan and a secondary scan using all of that information we've just discussed. So here's our instrument panel again on the PFD. Like I said, the attitude indicator is our master instrument. That's the one we refer back to and scan the most. Every couple of seconds we're looking back at this instrument. So we're checking here that the desired attitude is being maintained and that the wings are either level or we have the desired angle of bank that we want as well. If we've just entered IMC, then probably the first thing we're going to do is just fly the aeroplane in the attitude that we will maintain when we enter the cloud. Attitudes are going to look a little bit different on the attitude indicator. So as part of today's lesson, I'm going to familiarise you with what the attitude for straight and level flight looks like at the typical power settings, but also what the attitudes look like on the instrument for climbing and descending and turns as well, because you are used to seeing these things visually. So we scan the attitude indicator. Then across to the airspeed indicator, we check that the airspeed is as expected and constant. Back to the attitude indicator. Check again, attitude and angle of bank. Across to the altimeter, is the altitude as expected? Maybe we're looking for it to be constant. Back to the attitude indicator, down to the HSI. Check the direction is being maintained if we're trying to maintain straight level flight, for example. And back up to the attitude indicator again. So see how we're constantly referring back to that attitude indicator every few seconds, and this scan, this cycle, continues quite rapidly. This is how we control the airplane. So instrument interpretation, instrument cross-check, aircraft control, that three-step process. Another thing you'll note today in the flight is that you're used to seeing the changes of attitude, angle of bank outside. Little changes on the instruments, such as when we change from a straight and level attitude, like is being indicated here, to a climb attitude where it's 7.5 degrees, nose pitch up, say, that's not a big movement on the instrument. It's only a couple of millimeters. But outside, that is a big movement of the aircraft's nose. So it's important to remember this so you don't over-control the airplane. You don't want to be rough, you don't want to be abrupt, and you want to remember that small adjustments inside correspond to large adjustments outside. So that's our primary scan. Every couple of sweeps of that, we also need to incorporate the ancillary instruments and the other performance instruments in what is known as the secondary scan. So attitude indicator, and then we might have a check of the slip skid bar, make sure that we are in balance, and back to the attitude indicator, and then across to the vertical speed indicator. Check that that is as expected. If we're trying to fly level, then it should be 0. Back to the attitude indicator, and then a scan of our engine instruments. We should continue to scan the T's and P's just like any flight, but also check the power settings, because remember, power settings is a control instrument, directly affecting the performance that we see on every other instrument in the aircraft. Really, this briefing is just about that. like this whole lesson, Intro to Instrument Flying, is just introducing them to that scan. So you think back to when you all did this, it's a discipline thing, right? You have to instill in them that the scan has to be continuous, it has to be rapid, it has to encompass all of those instruments that we actually talked about, because what happens? They fixate on one of the instruments, and all of a sudden, yeah, they're doing a great job of maintaining this heading here, but we're now descending at 1,000 feet per minute because there's been a breakdown in that scan. They're fixating on only one instrument. So all the problems arise from the scan not being done either as it should be, or not quickly enough, or not believing what the instruments actually say. So it's all about discipline. Okay, so aircraft control, the third step in that instrument interpretation, instrument cross-check, aircraft control. So we need to develop a mental picture of what we want the aeroplane to do, whether that's straight and level flight, or whether it's a climb, a descent, or a medium turn. Developing a mental picture of this will help to avoid disorientation for when we actually set the aeroplane up into that maneuver. You're still going to do the same processes as you've previously learned. So when we're entering a climb, you still do power, attitude, trim, leveling off. It's still attitude, power, trim, and so on. That doesn't change. You're still using your select, hold, trim processes. Just now you're going to be using the instruments to set the attitude. So you'll select the desired attitude. Again, I'll show you what that looks like on the instruments today. Allow the airspeed time to settle, and then trim. Trimming is always important, but even more so in instrument flying, because you do not want to fight the aeroplane. You want to remove all of the stick forces so that A, you're not fighting the aeroplane, and B, you are minimizing the likelihood of you actually getting disorientated. Just have to wait for the PowerPoint to sort itself out. Alright, so that brings us to the end of that slide. Tell us to do it again. Okay, so we trimmed and we're following that same process, select, hold, trim. It's really important to trim promptly, to trim accurately. If we don't trim, we're more likely to end up in an unusual attitude and fall victim to disorientation. This is not an IFR flight, an instrument flight rules flight. So at no point in this visual part of your training are we actually going to enter cloud. We're going to simulate it. So when we actually are in the simulator, I can place the aircraft into cloud there, but when we do the flight part of this training, we will simulate finding yourself in inadvertent IMC by using a hood. You've probably seen a hood at ops. So that's how we will simulate it. We'll get to flight into actual cloud later on when we talk about your instrument rating. I've mentioned already that this is a situation that we should avoid with thorough pre-flight and in-flight planning, timely decision-making, appropriate decision-making. We should be able to avoid a situation where we are in inadvertent IMC. Despite that, if you have a look at the CAA statistics, this is a common cause of incidents and accidents every single year. Like, it really is quite common. I don't know if I sent it to your chat or if I sent it to the other chat, but CAA just released, or had a news media release a couple of days ago that they've prosecuted a microlight pilot for landing in 150 meters of visibility in and fog with a passenger on board. They just prosecuted him $6,500. Okay, so you've done your human factors exam by now. You're aware that there are different illusions that we can fall victim to when we lose our eyesight. Our orientation is mostly dependent on our eyesight. About 80% of our orientation comes from sight. So as soon as we lose that, all the other types of orientation, only 20%, start to send conflicting signals to the brain. And this can lead to disorientation and ending up in an unusual attitude, losing control of the aeroplane. So how do we avoid that? Today is about developing your awareness of these illusions, when they might occur, and how to avoid succumbing to them. And this is really by trusting your instruments, by keeping the instrument scan going. So one great example of when pilots have not trusted their instruments I can think of is, I think it was a Air China flight on a 747 decades ago now, and they were cruising at 40,000 feet and they had an engine failure. And the aeroplane can fly quite safely on 3 engines, but anyway, they had an engine failure and the autopilot tripped out, but then all 3 pilots got distracted trying to get the engine going again. Unsuccessful with that because at 40,000 feet there wasn't enough oxygen to get the engine going again. But the autopilot had tripped out and none of them were flying the aeroplane. And then after unsuccessfully getting the engine going, they finally looked at the instruments. All of the instruments were indicating that the aeroplane had entered a very steep, nose down, spiral dive attitude. Not a single one of the 3 pilots with tens of thousands of hours of experience believed what the instruments were telling them, despite all 3 of the primary flight instruments indicating the same thing. They just didn't believe it because there had been a breakdown in the scan and they didn't trust what the instruments were telling them. They were very lucky. They actually did survive. The aeroplane finally got out of its spiral dive at about 10,000 feet above the ocean, only when they could finally see the horizon, because they were, I don't remember if it was at night or if it was in cloud. I think it was just in cloud, so it lost the visual orientation. But chunks of the aeroplane had been ripped off because of the high G-forces, the bay doors had been ripped off, chunks of the elevator and flight controls had been ripped off. Passengers were who weren't strapped down were severely injured, but everyone survived. Probably only because they popped out of cloud at 10,000 feet and finally knew what exactly was happening. But all the instruments had been telling them. Now, if it can happen to airline pilots with 3 flight instruments each, a flight instrument each, with tens of thousands of hours of experience, this could surely happen to us. So it's about being disciplined with the instruments, trusting what they're actually telling us. It's important not to fly when you are feeling unwell for all the reasons you've learned about previously, but you don't want to get pressure vertigo as well. Your balance organs are very susceptible to changes in pressure. If you've got congestion, blocked ears, blocked sinuses, this could send conflicting information to the brain and be misinterpreted. And again, you could end up in an unusual attitude, lose control of the aeroplane. We also want to avoid sudden head movements and head movements that stimulate movement around more than one axis at a time. So we don't want to, say, bob your head down and move it to the left at the same time, because this can stimulate or overstimulate the orientation systems and lead to, again, mixed signals from the brain and disorientation. What's probably really being described there is like the Coriolis illusion, which is pretty nasty, has resulted in accidents before. It's also important here to remember not to be rough on the aircraft controls as well. Being rough on the controls can also send conflicting signals to the brain. Be gentle. It will also be easier to set and control attitudes and fix attitudes if you are gentle on the controls. And remember, small movements inside on the instruments correspond to big movements outside. Whenever you're instrument flying, we always have a safety pilot. Now, for your PPL training, I act as your safety pilot, your instructor acts as your safety pilot, will always be on board, but once you're a license holder, it is possible for you to do some instrument flying without an instructor on board, but there needs to be a safety pilot who understands their obligations. So we deal with that in that phase of flight as well. Now let's have a chat about those specific illusions. These illusions are really either kinesthetic, which is the seat of the pants ones, or they are vestibular. So you might recall your vestibular organs are the otolith and the semicircular canals, and the types of illusions we can get from them. Do you remember any of those? So you could ask some questions, you could ask them how they were caused. The things I usually have a bit of a chat about are the leans, somatogravic, somatogyral, subthreshold stimulation, all of those, so make sure you have a little bit of background knowledge. For those of you who attended Isaac's lecture the other week, he got the whole class to stand up, close their eyes, and stand on one leg and see how easy that was to do, and must have been I almost came crashing down, so it's a good example of how when you lose your sight, your orientation is pretty poor. It doesn't affect everyone to the same degree, but get the class to stand up and do that. Or if you can think of any other experiments that can help to prove these things on the ground, do that, because it adds value, it adds interest, rather than just sitting down at all times. You also spend a bit of time in the flight, setting a scenario where these illusions are created and seeing if the student can detect them, if they can tell what the aircraft's doing. If you check out the CAA Flight Instructor Guide for Instrument Flying Introduction, it gives you guidance on how to change the attitudes to stimulate these illusions, and they do work. Often you'll do one of these and the student will be adamant, no, we're flying wings level, you're actually banking in one direction, so they do work. So have a read of that stuff, but you'll talk more about that in the pre-flight briefing when you do this with your actual instructors as well. Okay, so vestibular, explain the background behind those, and muscular ones, or what is also known as the kinesthetic ones, that's the seat of the pants stuff. So you've got pressure sensors over your body, so they're able to detect right now that you're sat down and I'm stood up. The problem with these is that they're not able to figure out where or why that pressure is created. For example, if I do a 60-degree angle of bank turn, where we pull 2 Gs, and then I do a loop, where I correctly execute it and say also pull 2 Gs, your brain cannot tell whether that was from a looping maneuver or whether that was from a 60-degree angle of bank turn. This could lead to disorientation as well. Now, I'd never condone what I'm about to tell you, never do this with your student, especially not in especially not in the DA40, but when I got to the instrument flying part of my training, the instructor was an aerobatic aircraft, and for this part, the instructor said, okay, take your hands and feet off the controls, and he actually did a loop and asked me what we'd done. I had no idea what we had just done, that we'd been upside down. I could feel the Gs, but I had no idea what we'd just done. I'd never done aerobatics before, of course, and then he did another one and I almost threw up, so don't do that. But it's an example of just how unreliable the kinesthetic sensors actually are when you don't have eyesight to back it up. So what's the moral here? How do we avoid these things from happening? By keeping that instrument scan, the primary and the secondary instrument scan going, and by trusting our instruments. Now, this will take time and it requires discipline, because you will fall victim to all of these illusions, particularly the leans. You will be adamant that the aeroplane is doing one thing. You will feel as if the aeroplane is banked, and so naturally you will try to roll the wings level. And it actually requires a lot of discipline to trust what the instruments are saying, that you're actually in straight level flight, and go with that as opposed to what you feel the aeroplane is doing. You've all done some aerobatics. Have any of you suffered from any of these illusions from doing aerobatics? I remember I did when I used to do aerobatics. The leans was always a bad one for me, like especially pulling out of a loop where you're converting that speed back to height, or coming out of a spin. Like I would feel as if the aeroplane was doing that, but actually we'd be doing that. It used to affect me quite badly. Anyone else?
Mostly in IFI, IMC.
Yeah.
I get someone in.
Yeah. So have a chat to your students about any of these things that you've actually experienced, because again, that adds interest and value and tells the student, hey, this actually happens, not just to Air China pilots 20 years ago, it happens to us today, right now. And that's why they need to know about it. Okay, so you can finish off with some revision questions. What is the answer to the top one?
All the electronic instruments, like the Garmin.
Everything on the PFD and MFD then? Yep. What about the standbys?
I mean, it'll last for a while, but then eventually when
Which ones would fail?
the AI,
Okay, yep.
Until you hit the switch.
What about the compass? Would that fail? What's the other one? The altimeter, would that fail?
no,
Isn't there another one? What's the other standby instrument?
airspeed,
Yeah, would that fail?
no,
Okay. What about the second question there?
None of them.
Yeah, none of them aside from well, the engine instruments, they don't fail, they just indicate that you've got no oil pressure or whatever. So yeah, nothing fails initially, right? It requires that half an hour before your battery finally fails and then you lose all your MFD and PFD stuff. So my moral with these kind of questions is that actually they've got to have a good systems knowledge for instrument flying, because we have a chat about what to do in the next briefing when we get different instruments that fail. So, you know, the limited panel stuff. Well, if we're actually in IMC, that's a bad enough situation, and now we've had the PFD or MFD fail, wouldn't we do something about that rather than just accept, oh, now we're only limited to those instruments? So that's where you can say, yes, systems knowledge is important. Know what type of instruments they are, static or gyroscopic or electrical. So I question that in particular in the next briefing. You could do that in this briefing if you really wanted to. And this is where I also talk about, so coming back to that scenario, we've out in the on a cross-country flight or training area today, and weather's deteriorated rapidly. We've found ourselves in IMC. We've learned that instrument scan, so we've actually successfully controlling the aeroplane. But what else could we do to make life a little bit easier to help us get out of this IMC? Well, we could set the autopilot on, because they probably know how to use the basic functions of that by now. That straight away reduces the workload. We could talk to ATC, we could make a mayday call, because this is a pretty serious situation. Make a mayday call, maybe get some guidance from them. Maybe we've tried to climb, descend, or turn around out of IMC and that hasn't worked. Maybe they could vector us to somewhere where the skies are clearer. Look, in a real emergency, they would help you with that kind of stuff. Terrain features, better turn that on. There's pretty high terrain around Palma. You don't want to go flying into terrain, which happens so often in these kind of accidents. So talk a little bit about that stuff, because this lesson is really all about the instrument scan, the primary and secondary instrument scan, as well as how to fly the aeroplane in straight level, climbing and descending, and medium turns and rate 1 turns. That's instrument flying introduction. That's what we do on this one. I've talked about how to simulate this already. We'll experience some of the illusions on this flight. That's quite an important part. There's different ways you can do this. Look at the CAA guidance, but the other thing I do with them is, have you ever read that article about the 45-second rule? It was actually written by someone here at Massey, but they found on average that when a pilot entered IMC, they only had about 45 seconds on average before they lost control of the aeroplane, when they were deprived of any visual reference and didn't know how to use the aircraft instruments to control the aeroplane. That's not long, 45 seconds. So what you can do with your student is actually, you set the aeroplane up in straight level, get them to, and then tell them to close their eyes when they're in control of the aeroplane and see how long they actually can keep it in straight level flight. Inevitably, they'll start to bank or pitch up or pitch down, and see how long it actually takes for that to happen. Sometimes, some students, it's like 10 seconds and they've lost control. Others maybe a little bit longer. It's quite a good exercise to illustrate it. Usually the giveaway when they really know they've not in strain level anymore, is they can hear the air noise changing. That's usually the giveaway. Okay, so we're going to have a look at that primary and secondary scans for straight level flight, because if we've just entered inadvertent IMC, probably the first thing we're going to do is immediately go to that scan, keeping the wings level until we are ready to start turning around or climbing descent out of IMC. And I've talked about this as well. All the problems really come from fixation on one instrument or a breakdown in the scan, so that is, they're not scanning all of the instruments, not believing what is actually being displayed on those instruments as well. Okay, maybe check I didn't miss anything. Oh yeah, another accident you could talk about if you wanted to when you get to the illusions part is a somatic gravic illusion that caused a crash. There's a metro liner crashed in Australia, taking off at night again, or no visual reference, right? And the somatic gravic is the acceleration one, so where you accelerate, it feels as if you're pitching up. So what the pilot does then is then pitch rapidly down. And this metro crashed shortly after takeoff. And of course, they can never prove usually that these illusions are the cause of the crash, but they found no problem with any of the flight controls. The engines were working normally, plenty of fuel, they hadn't failed or anything. There was nothing on the flight data, the cockpit voice recorder to suggest that there'd been any problem. Just the pilot flying pushed rapidly forward on the control column or whatever it is in those aeroplanes shortly after takeoff, and they suspected one of their probable causes was a somatic gravic illusion. And it's not been the first time that that's happened either.
Isn't it that air crash we watched at the end of Isaac's lecture?
Yeah.
It was that Air Dubai or whatever it was, the A320.
So there's heaps of examples of these things, eh? So talk about a few of them. Any questions on that?